everyone, welcome to this month's A Garden in Every Season tour. For the month of June, I wanted to highlight some of our deciduous ferns that are coming up in the garden, as well as the Kalmia or Mountain Laurel, which is finally in flower. So I hope you all enjoy, and let's get started.
All right, so just a brief weather recap. For us here in Highlands and for other parts of the East Coast as well, we experienced about 2 weeks of no rain, which certainly impacted the garden. There was lots of watering to be done for some of our new native plantings, but in looking at the long-term forecast for Highlands, we are expected to get more rain in our area, which is great, and I know that our plants will certainly appreciate it as well. We did have a few showers earlier today, and they're calling for a bit more as I'm filming this, which is great. But I wanted to introduce our very first plant of our garden tour, which is fancy fern.
So one of the first plants that I wanted to highlight for this tour is Dryopteris intermedia, common name fancy fern. It's in the Dryopteridaceae family, and like all ferns, it reproduces by spores, which are on the back of the fronds here, and those will develop later on in the season. And it's evergreen to semi-evergreen. It really just depends on how harsh your winters are. And something to note about the fronds as well is they are bipinnately compound. So you have this longer frond itself, and then these two that extend perpendicular to each other. And it typically likes, very moist soils. We're lucky here that we get lots of rain in Highlands, so we don't have to worry about that. But if you're planting this in your landscape, it doesn't really like any kind of dry soils. Another thing to note is it is a more clumping fern versus ones that spread out. So if you plan to add this to your landscape, it's nice to kind of plant a few around just so you add some interesting texture. And once again, it has a lovely green foliage.
The next plant that I wanted to highlight, aside from the fancy ferns along the path here, and right next door, we have our Canada Mayflower. So the scientific name is Menianthemum canadense, or Canada Mayflower, as I said. It has these very small, distinct, glabrous leaves that you'll typically just find two of them, and the flowers themselves are very diminutive and they're always white, but it makes a really lovely creeping ground cover. You can see more of it along here as we walk along this path, and it does prefer shade and moist soils. The next plant that I wanted to highlight here is solemn seal. The botanical name is Polygonatum biflorum. It's in the Ruscaceae family, and the leaves are alternate and the flowers themselves hang below the leaf axis, and they're a very nice cream colored and have some green tips as well if you look closely. And this is a very prolific native perennial throughout the East Coast. It does well in dappled sun to full shade and can be divided in the fall once it goes dormant. Seed can also be collected as well. Our next plant is Geranium maculatum, also known as wild geranium and sometimes spotted geranium as well. This plant, similarly to our Solomon seal, is a pretty prolific native perennial. It enjoys dappled sun to full shade, and the distinct leaves are lobed, and they'll always have 5 lobes. And the flowers themselves are bright purple, and if you look close, they have these kind of purplish anthers as well. And it makes a wonderful ground cover, and the bloom time extends far into the middle of June and actually began in late May. So, a wonderful plant for the landscape. So the next plant for this garden tour is our false Solomon seal, which the scientific name is Mountain racemosum, and the most distinguishing feature to denote between the two is this inflorescence, which is a raceme, which is what the specific epithet racemosum is in reference to, but that hangs above the leaves versus below the leaves in our typical common Solomon seal. The flowers themselves are also a bit different with their shape. They're star-shaped versus the Solomon seal flowers are bell-shaped. But the fruit is very beautiful, and it's a bright red when it develops in fall. Similarly to the plants that I've discussed so far, it does enjoy full shade to dappled sunlight. Down here we have one of our lasting trilliums still in flower. This is Trillium basii. If you watched our previous A Garden in Every Season tour where I went over the different trillium types, this is a pedicellate trillium, and the flowers, the petals themselves are very recurved, but it's exciting that this basii trillium is still in flower. Oh, and there's a sweet robin that's hopping along the forest floor. The next plant I wanted to speak about is Camellarium luteum. The common name is fairy wand. It has a tall spike of flowers, and the leaves themselves are what we call a basal rosette. So it's just a span of flowers that then shoot up from that. And something very interesting to note about the flowers is that they are dioecious. So that means that the male flowers and the female flowers exist separately on two separate plants. And the male flowers tend to be sort of curved down. They tend to sag a bit more than the female flowers, which is an interesting thing to note. And right next door, we also have one of our lasting Trillium species, and that is Trillium catesbii. The pedicel of Trillium catesbii hangs below the leaves, and the petals themselves often come out a very soft pink, and as they age, depending on their environment as well, they will turn a darker pink, similarly to our Trillium grandiflorum, which comes out white and then will turn a deep, deep pink as it ages. Up here we have our Mountain Laurel, which is getting ready to flower, and I will touch on that in more detail later on in this video. Off to the left here we also have a nice patch of orange jewelweed that's coming up, and that'll be in flower later on in the season, around August or so. We've got some Galax, which again I will touch on in a little bit more detail later on in this video. There's lots around, which is nice. You'll notice as you're walking around our botanical garden and maybe just out in the woods, some new leaf debris, and just down here we have the fallen flowers and leaves from our tulip trees, and the botanical name is Liriodendron tulipifera. We have a leaf miner which has carved out its little trail in some of the leaves which have fallen, and it's in the Magnoliaceae family tulip trees, and the flowers are quite similar, which I think is interesting. But Liriodendron, it's up for debate, but it's a monotypic genus usually. And another interesting note about tulip poplars is their importance in the silviculture industry. So tulip trees are still very widely used in wood lumber and a very valued species in the silviculture and forestry industries. But yeah, as you look down, you see lots of the petals and flower remnants that have fallen from the tops of the trees. These are just some of the foam flowers that are going to seed Tiarella cordifolia, which I went over in our last video. And we've got another Solomon seal here, and you can notice those hanging bell-shaped flowers, which are different from the false Solomon seal. And over here on the left we have Calycanthus, sometimes called sweetbush or Carolina allspice. The flowers are typically burgundy to red. They're flowering right now and have a really beautiful fragrance. And down here we have a nice patch of cucumber root, Mediola virginiana. It's in the Liliaceae family, which, looking at the leaves, it is somewhat similar. So the leaf pattern is whorled around the stem, and then you have this upper portion which holds the flowers. And again, because it's in the Liliaceae family, and if you kind of think to some of our other native lily species like Lilium superbum, for example, it has those hanging anthers and reflexed petals, which I think is very interesting. And of course, as the common name suggests, cucumber root, when harvested, is said to taste a bit like a cucumber. But I do not condone digging up the plant to find out whether or not that's true. Another thing that I wanted to mention, and something that has been repeated similarly with the species that I have gone over in this tour so far, is the cucumber root does prefer shade and moist soils. It does tolerate heat, which is nice, and the fall interest is another appealing aspect to this plant. So those whorled leaves will actually turn a bright red come fall. And down here we have Galax, scientific name Galax ursulata, which is a very prolific species here in the highlands and at the biological station because we are a part of the acidic cove forest type. So you'll really find it in these understory areas below rhododendrons in that kind of acidic soil. And the inflorescent type is a spike, and as you can see, these are just beginning to flower. They have soft, small white flowers, and the foliage, as I mentioned, is evergreen, and it's very shiny and glossy and has that serrated leaf margin as well. And something to note is this plant is becoming less prevalent as it's more popularized as an herb and continues to be over harvested. But in the wild, again, it's beautiful, and because it's evergreen, it will turn almost reddish purple, the foliage, in wintertime because of the presence of those anthocyanins in the leaves. And just over here, we have one of our deciduous native ferns. This is Ediantum pedatum. It's our northern maidenhair, but it really stretches, obviously, all the way down here to North Carolina. And just over here we have another one of our deciduous native ferns, Clismunda clatonia, otherwise known as interrupted fern, and that common name is due to the presence of the sori, which is how the ferns are propagated, interrupting the leaves as they are emerging in spring. Along the boardwalk here we have lots of bushy St. John's wort, which is Hypericum densiflorum. We have a beautiful view of the pond and the bog across the way. Above us there is a serviceberry that is going into fruit, and those fruits will develop later on in the month and they are edible. And lastly, I wanted to wrap up our tour talking about our native mountain laurel.
So this is Kalmia latifolia. It's in the Ericaceae family, which is where we get all of our blueberries. And if you all watched last month's garden tour, the leucothoe, our mountain dog hobble, is also in this family as well. And it's typically an evergreen shrub. It can get quite tall, up to 10 feet, and it's prevalent all throughout the Highlands area, as we are part of the acidic cove type forest, so it does like those more acidic soils. And it's flowering right now, and it will continue to flower through the halfway, I would say, June. And the flower color typically is this sort of soft pink. You have some of these brighter pink buds. There are also white variations, flower colors that look a bit more pink, and there's also many, many cultivars in the nursery trade. An interesting thing to note about the flowers are the anthers. So the anthers are set in the corolla, which is this major part right here, and they're typically tucked into little pockets within the corolla, and when a pollinator comes to visit, those anthers will then be released. So it has a touch mechanism that then releases the pollen to the pollinator so that they can then carry it out throughout the other flowers. Thank you all so much for joining me on June's A Garden in Every Season tour. Please let us know what plants you liked or if you have any questions, and I hope that you all will visit us in the garden very soon.